Hello, welcome to the Power Platform Architecture Series for Power Virtual Agents. I'm Matt Farmer. I'm in the Power Platform CAT team, working with Power Virtual Agents. And with me I have...
Hi, everyone. My name's Kent Weare. I'm also a PM within the Power CAT team. And what we're here today to talk about is the Power Platform Architecture Series. And what this series is a series of patterns and practices that are designed for architects, developers, and IT professionals to really help enable your use cases and get you unblocked with the latest content for Power Virtual Agents and our extensibility capabilities as well. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to actually talk about another extensibility opportunity, and that is using the Azure Bot Framework. Now, in the previous session, we talked about how you can extend your Power Virtual Agents using Power Automate. And we talked about that being a no-code approach to extensibility. Now what we're going to start to do is we're going to move up the stack, and we're going to talk what I would consider low code, and then starting to get into a little bit of pro code extensibility as well. So Matt, take it away. Let's see what you got to show for us today.
Well, we're going to start like we've done with all these sessions with our architecture diagram. So if
yes.
you can follow along. I know it's your favorite part of the session. So we've talked about the kind of the basics within PVA, building out topics and channels. And then we have taken you through using the Power Platform, using Power Automate and connectors to build out extensibility with PVA. And you can do an awful lot with that. You can build, some pretty complicated solutions and do it really, really quickly. But sometimes there's scenarios where you want to take it a little bit further, where you have very specific requirements. And that's really where we're going into today, how you can use Azure and the Azure Bot Framework to really hit some of those very specific requirements, because you have a little bit more control and a bit more flexibility, but conversely, you also have more responsibility in what you're building. So yes, Power Automate, Bot Framework Composer, and Bot Framework Skills, and we've very much in this slide got one following after the other, because there is a step up each time in the amount of work you need to do to implement them. So, I mean, our first tip here is always Power Automate is probably where you should start. But this slide kind of summarizes the differences. Power Automate is that no code. I mean, we say low code, but it's really a no code experience. You can use the library of connectors. You can, it all runs in its own process that's SaaS, so you don't have to manage it. It matches the Power Platform application lifecycle model, which we'll talk about in the later session, using solutions. You can integrate to backends, you can integrate to SaaS systems, all with that library of connectors. But can you do things like control your dialogues completely when you're doing that in PVA? Not so much. Can be a little higher latency. Again, it's not high latency, just relatively could be higher than some of the other ways we can implement dialogues within PVA. And when you use Power Automate, you're using Power Virtual Agents AI engine to implement your bot. Next step up is Bot Framework Composer. And that one is kind of it's a low-code experience, but it's going to be something that's much more familiar to pro devs, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail in a minute. It's a custom tooling running on the desktop, so again, it feels a bit like an IDE. When you do it, though, the way the integration works, and we'll show you this, it's running in Power Virtual Agents, and there's a big benefit to that. The application lifecycle is also with solutions, so that's very, very useful. Yes, you can integrate with backends, but it's based on HTTP requests, but you have big control of things like dialogues in what you're building up and showing to the bot. I'll show you an example of what that means. And it can be lower latency if you need to do HTTP requests out to backend systems. Finally, Bot Framework Skills, and this is where we take all the kind of the training wheels off the system and allow you complete pro dev control on building out your bot. But conversely, you also have to take complete responsibility for that when you're building it, including things like what AI engine are you using with the code you're building. Let's dip into those a bit more. Some rules about the way in which we do it, though. As I said before, generally, if you're unsure, start with PVA plus Power Automate, right? Kent will probably echo this, but we quite often see customers diving into this area who think their requirement is super complicated and make the whole architecture very complicated to start with. Sometimes you'd be surprised what you can achieve with just PVA plus Power Automate. And if you're not sure, it probably doesn't take you very long to model that. So go and try those things first before you step up. Doesn't mean you can't, but it's a good tactic in designing what you should do. Bot Framework Composer, the sweet spot, is really around doing things that require complex dialogue. So things like, there's a concept within it called language generation. I want to generate the response to a customer within the bot, and there's going to be a bunch of variables I use to do that. Some of that you can do with PVA, but really complicated stuff is going to be great in Bot Framework Composer. It's also got access to a bunch of conversation mechanics we don't have in PVA natively at the moment. Things like what we call adaptive cards, and we'll show you that, and also showing a vast range of options in the card. But bigger learning curve, much more options, more possibility for error. And finally, Bot Framework Skills, and that's really the one, as I said, greatest level of flexibility, but you're taking complete control for running the service, and you have to plug in your own AI model and things like that.
Yeah, it is interesting. I ran into this actually yesterday. I was working with a customer, and I was showing them Bot Framework Composer, and hopefully I don't spoil anything here. But it was just one of those conversations of like, they've done some work with Flow or Power Automate. This was the first time they were seeing Composer. There were some things that naturally they were interested that you're going to talk about here on the screen, but it was that conversation of where should I start? And what I suggested was they needed to call a backend API. And I suggested start there and then figure out how complex that API is. Because there might be some tools inside of Power Automate, such as parse JSON and using the HTTP connector, or maybe even using like the on-premise data gateway if it's a local API, that might actually help you make that decision itself. And so what I had suggested was start with that backend and then make your way forward. And then if there's things that become more difficult in one or the other tools, then that might help drive that decision-making process for you.
Yeah, I think this is definitely one of those ones that is where people look to kind of the architects or lead developers or COE to really give people, just because you have technology and you can do something doesn't mean you always should. And it's like, how do I make the choice on what I should use for each scenario? And this very much what the guidance here we're hoping will help with. So that's what Bot Framework Composer looks like. Those of you who've used kind of dev tools, I think things like BizTalk in time will probably recognize some of the way in which it works. But it definitely has pro code elements to it, so we can write code in it. I'll show you that in a minute. How does it manifest in PVA? Again, I'll demo that, but effectively there's a link in PVA. At the moment it's in preview, it will be GA at some point soon, that allows you to open Bot Framework from PVA. So you start in PVA, you work out what you do, and then you open the tooling to be able to use Composer. It's that button there. And there's some examples of PVA topics. I'll jump across the demo and we'll look at those for real. The thing to point out is the Bot Framework Composer resources built via PVA. You can build Bot Framework resources completely outside PVA, and that is different. The ones built in PVA, when you save them, they are packaged up with your PVA environment, so you can move them around in solutions. That makes the ALM process with these much, much easier. The natural language engine that we're using to process is the PVA one, so again, you don't need to worry about that. So this is definitely a smoother way to get this sort of functionality built, because really it moves around where PVA moves around and they're not separate. So yeah, they run in the PVA process. You do have to do some extra work to make sure you're publishing back from Bot Framework Composer off your local machine back into PVA. Easy mistake to make sometimes. If you're not sure, you need to make sure that cycle of make changes, publish, save is there. And yes, at the moment in PVA, Composer from PVA, we're using PVA's recognizer. It's marked in Composer as the default recognizer. Just be careful we don't. There are some limitations on that, like for example, you can't use regular expressions at the top level the recognizer. And that's the thing that recognizes the phrases that come in and works out what to do with them. This sort of thing you normally see in PVA. You can't use a custom point. Sorry, Ken.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. No, I just wanted to emphasize, like how important this is. So if you think about the natural progression of any sort of software project where you've got multiple environments, now you're maintaining multiple basically platforms or instances of that bot as well. So if you think about the benefits of Composer and how all of that configuration gets stored in Microsoft Dataverse with the rest of your config, that like dramatically simplifies how you would go ahead and deploy all of those assets instead of just managing like a dev instance of bot framework service and a test instance of bot framework service and then a prod naturally. So that is definitely one of the advantages of using Composer, and then you don't have to pay for another runtime as well, which is naturally going to be
that's
tough.
a big one. You're not paying for somewhere else to run this stuff. It's running in PVA included in your license. Yeah, that's a really important one. So let me just jump out of PowerPoint now and to PVA, and we'll just walk you through showing you how this works. So this is the PVA architecture bot example. So the link to this is in the show notes below. So you can actually import this solution and see it for yourself. What we've got here, you can actually see some bot framework composer assets that we've already set up. So the specials, this is a trigger that was imported in from bot framework. Daily specials here is the dialog that was actually set up. And if I open it up, you can see that it links back into bot framework composer. So they exist within PVA once you publish them, just like other PVA topics. So others can come in and edit and manage them as well. I'm going to jump into bot framework composer and show you how you would build that. When you do that, this little dialog comes up. I have opened Composer already, so it's just going to connect me in. It wants me to update. Every time you do that, it will. So again, the idea being that it makes sure you don't get out of sync between PVA and your local machine. So this is just a few examples that have already been set up. So you saw that specials trigger there that had been imported in. There is also the dialog for specials. So we'll jump in and have a look at that. Now, what this one does is something that's a little bit difficult to do in PVA, and it has a nicer experience when you build it in Composer. So we've used to build this out a dialog that allows people to choose the day of the week. And you'll see it when I demo it in a minute. But effectively, we have done things like label this as a conversation days array, given it the array values it needs, and then we're prompting for multiple choice selection from that array we've actually provisioned. Jumping back to PVA, you can see this. So if I go here and type specials, it pops up a dialog that looks like this. Now, this is currently not possible within PVA. To get something that looks like this, you would need to use Composer to do it. So I can select the day of the week. And of course, this is all running in the PVA runtime, but using that bot framework Composer configuration. So that's a very informative hiking boots at 10% off on Mondays. Go and have a look at something that's even more pro dev is this one here. So this is products. So what this is a dialog that shows an adaptive card. Now, adaptive cards are kind of a standard format that allows you to nicely show formatting, things like images and things like that, and send them to a particular UI. We can show those adaptive cards within PVA's conversation flow, but we need to use bot framework composer to do it. So this dialog refers to a property that's actually been configured in code. So if I jump across here, we'll see that this code has been set up here. I can actually go into the code view, and then you can actually see the code that has been written to set this up. So it's defining some variables, bat, boots, and ball. It's setting image URLs as well for those variables, and then it's actually processing the build out of the adaptive card, setting properties on it in code. And then effectively the card reference, the response refers to that code and renders it out. So those are the sorts of things you can do. And I say that you can actually get more, a lot more interesting than these simple examples, right? But you can do things like language generation. You can have complicated multi-turn dialogue flows that maybe that you wouldn't have within PVA. And then when you're done with that, you simply publish. So I select publish and publish the selected bot back to PVA. When I've done that, all the changes are committed. I go back to PVA and I don't have to worry about this environment until I next want to use it.
It's probably worth, let's chat a little bit about that language generation, because that's actually one of my favorite, well, I shouldn't say favorite, it's a feature I do like within Bot Framework Composer. And so I guess essentially what it is for folks that may not be aware is you can actually go ahead and provide multiple responses. So say you want to send a response after, say, a question, and you can overload that response with multiple sort of instances, and you can tailor it differently so that your bot doesn't sound so bot-like, right? So mechanical. And you can also use it to give your bot a little bit of personality, which I think is quite cool. So in the case of adaptive cards, maybe that isn't as relevant, but certainly when you're going to go ahead and just provide text responses, all you need to do is hit the enter key and add another line. And then what'll happen is randomly one of those options will get selected. And I thought that's pretty cool. And I know I've had some interest from other customers about, like, you know, I want to give my bot more personality, and maybe that's an option that can help with that as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's I'll probably add a demo to this as well for that. But yeah, it's one of those ones that, again, also makes people feel that the bot experience is a bit magic. So particularly for those really key scenarios, you could implement that as well.
And then I guess the other thing for folks to be aware of is, like, when you have the Bot Framework Composer here, you can use this outside of PVA. And there's a subtle difference that you will notice when you do so, is that you'll have a test harness that'll show up in the right-hand corner, or basically the ability to launch a test that will use the Bot Framework emulator. Now, when it comes to these PVA and Bot Framework Composer extensibilities, we want you doing all of that testing inside of PVA, so you don't actually see those options. But in case there's folks that might be coming from the Bot Framework world into PVA and going, hey, who moved my cheese? It was moved, but it was moved for good reason. So all of that testing goes back up to the cloud.
I think you call that a really important point. At the moment, there is no super simple way to take a bot that you've already created in Bot Framework Composer and just run it in PVA. There's too many changes that PVA, or constrictions that PVA puts on it. Maybe something's done in the future. I don't think we have any particular view on that right now, but make sure you're not assuming that you can just take your bot, Composer bot, and just run it in PVA. It won't work. So yeah, I'll just show the products one working. I think delivery options is the trigger. I have to give it a city. And then there we go. So we can see some images are rendered, and it's managed the layout to make the card look presentable to the customer. So that's quite a common sort of use case that people are looking for, is to render a bunch of images. Adaptive cards is a good choice for that. Okay. There we go. Into the slides. Okay. So that was Bot Framework Composer with PVA. So let's say that Bot Framework Composer doesn't do everything you want it to do. So where do we go next? So the completely pro code approach is using the Azure Bot Framework SDK and building bot framework skills. A bot framework skill, I suppose the way to describe it is almost like it's kind of like a reusable component or an API of a bot that can be plugged into other bots. And we've talked before about how PVA is under the hood is a bot framework bot. Skills are ones you can plug into it, and they will work with PVA, and they also work with other bot framework bots. The real reason you should be using skills, I mean, you can build everything in skills if you want to, but really where you should be looking to use them is scenarios where you need super high levels of control or reusability, or you're inputting security, or you're looking at things that are very low latency. That's really where it shines. So building out a skill requires quite a number of steps. So it's certainly a lot more labor intensive and dev intensive than it would be to build with Composer or just with PVA. You need to create a manifest. I'll show you an example in a minute. Import that manifest, set up your bot, and then test your bot within PVA. Once you've got it running, it looks like any other action within PVA, which is very, very nice, but there's a certain amount of work to get there in the first place. A thing about Azure Bot Service, which your skill has to run on, the service is purpose-built for running bot framework bots. So just to be clear, the bot framework is an open source tooling and library that Microsoft builds. It's built and shared on GitHub. Azure Bot Service is the Azure service that can run those bots, and where a lot of customers do run them. But the thing with running bot framework skills is that you need to provision, secure, and manage that service in addition to PVA. That may be a benefit for some customers who are using it across a number of bots, or who want tight control on the scalability of that service, but you are going to have to do some extra work to work out how you manage and run it. And there's also a bunch of security stuff I've mentioned there. So bot service skills are secured through client ID and secret that you provision with Azure Active Directory, so the app registrations. You need to also set up things like lists of allowed callers, so you need to make sure your PVA bots can call it. There is another one that's very important, which is the same tenant restriction, and you probably have to work this out if you're building this into an ALM pipeline or different environments. You need to make sure the PVA users you have access to the Azure tenant that environment is linked to. And that's a real easy one to stumble on if you don't think all the way paths through of building this out across environments. So watch out for that one. Well, I'll show you an example manifest in a minute. There are some the manifest is kind of almost, if you're familiar with kind of a Swagger document with OpenAPI, the manifest is very similar to that. It's a thing that is JSON that describes all the stuff in the service. There's some restrictions with importing to PVA. Hopefully, most of you building out skills won't hit these too often. You need 25 or fewer actions, 25 or fewer inputs and outputs, and there's some limits on array types and things like that. Again, when building these out, simplicity first is good, because there's certainly some complexity in getting it all hooked together. Make sure you're thinking about the variables you're returning can be easily used within PVA conversations being one of them. I'm going to show you building out the manifest. Note there's a link there on the manifest schema and how to do that. And also there's a bunch of docs that will help you with actually have errors importing that manifest into PVA. Then we're going to implement our skill, which is really writing the code on the back end. There is a whole bunch of open source examples that the bot framework team provide in GitHub. I would highly recommend starting with one of those rather than doing everything from scratch. The example I've got here is based upon one of those. So let's do that now. So just showing you in PVA to start with. Let's reset my bot, but I have a skill that I have imported. So Okay, so we've seen the manifest and the skill set up within PVA. And you're probably wondering, what does that actually look like on the back end? We actually saw an example of this manifest before. I've actually built this out in Visual Studio. There's templates you can provision in Visual Studio that set up your bot. And you can also do that from the GitHub library as well. There's two kind of key files here that I'm going to show you. I mean, obviously this decrypt skill bot is the whole solution. But the two really key things here are the manifest itself. So the manifest here, says what kind of schema and type it is. It gives you information about the endpoints that are actually as part of the manifest and their address. There's also the activities, and these are the things that are going in and out. And you saw in the example in PVA, there was inputs and outputs defined. This is where they come from. They're defined here in the manifest, and I've got just here, this is an example using encryption of a value passed in, or decryption of it, an encrypted value. So I'm passing in the encrypted value. I'm passing back an ID value from the skill, and this is also like a classic example. So this is something used if you're not using standard authentication and you wanted to do something where you were locking down your bot, we're passing in an encrypted user ID and decrypting it to allow the bot to carry on. So again, make sure you follow that the link in the previous slide about setting up that manifest. It is quite specific. And the other thing I would do is I would approach this first, get the manifest working, get it working in PVA before you worry about implementing the code on the back end. You want to make sure that integration works before you start testing. To implement the bot itself, this decrypt skill bot, activity handler is the interface that really attaches this code to the manifest. And then I'm implementing the on message activity async, which is the thing that says when I get a message in, do something. And again, this sample code is in the package that we share at the bottom of the screen. So you can go in and have a look at the example here and use it to set up your own skill as well. So if you look at what we're doing here, we're showing how this code here is sending messages back to the chat. This is doing the token decryption and then sending it back to the chat with the result when we've finished. So once you've made those initial investments to connect the code up to the manifest, from there, you're writing code. There are a bunch of kind of interfaces you need to think about that are bot framework specific. And the other thing to be very important about and include is if you actually do want to do some natural language processing in here, you are going to have to hook up your bot to something like Lewis, Cognitive Services Lewis, to actually do that processing. So that have another cost and another component that you need to manage in your solution.
So I guess one of the benefits of being able to use VS Code or Visual Studio is breakpoints, right? So that debugging sort of experience comes with it. So it kind of, there's that complexity spectrum that you're dealing with, right? Like in PVA, generally it's quite simple. The exchange of back and forth between users, you don't necessarily need to set a breakpoint, but certainly when you start writing code, you do need that. And I guess that would be one of the sort of benefits or opportunities by using this approach, I guess.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, of course, once you do have the manifest set up and the integration set up and you've built out your PVA, hooks, then building and making edits isn't so bad, right? It's a normal dev lifecycle. It's just, I suppose, there's the initial investment of setting all that up that you need to consider, is it the right approach? As this is effectively a web app, then to deploy it, once it's set up, I can deploy from here, build and deploy from here to Azure if I wish. Devs familiar with this should be very familiar with the life cycle of managing this, checking it in, all that kind of stuff. Cool. Note to myself to include a demo of it working afterwards because it's not there, so I won't. So I'll add that in a bit. Okay, so the final bit we wanted to add to this is, I mean, we've talked about bot framework and things like that, but we did say it's integrating with Azure, right? And there are other ways in which people bring Azure into solutions involving Power Virtual Agents. The classic one is when they want to bring in their estate of applications. So if you have a bunch of line of business systems or custom apps or APIs that are sitting within Azure, how do you bring those into a PVA solution? Generally, that's done with HTTP APIs. And the kind of pattern that we suggest to customers normally involves using something like Azure API Management to front those APIs out from a consistent interface that can then be pulled into PVA. Now, normally that's done through Power Automate. You can use the HTTP connector. Again, there's no additional charge for using the HTTP connector in Power Automate when you're using it with PVA. And it can just make the call out to your existing Azure estate and bring in those results, process them, and return them to PVA. Should call out there is another approach that is using something like the on-premises data gateway. If the assets you're talking to are on-prem and you want kind of you don't have a big API estate or a pattern for doing this, then another approach is actually to go and use the on-premises data gateway, install that on-prem, and then that can be pulled into Power Automate, which is perhaps a simpler approach if you don't have all those assets existing and you just want a quick solution that will work. What does that look like? So we've got our architecture diagram again. If we want to add Azure onto that, we can connect to those HTTP endpoints from Power Automate. We could even build what's called a custom connector in Power Automate, so we could kind of do it once and then provide that solution for everybody else. But we can also connect into that estate from bot framework skills or even from Composer dialogues as well. Composer dialogues can make HTTP calls out, so they could connect into those APIs from there.
Yeah, and I guess just to add on to that, like APIM is a good practice, regardless, right? Anytime you've got some publicly exposed endpoint, even though it may be secured, fronting that with APIM just gives you a lot of agility and additional security, and then also the all of the built-in policies. So I think it is a good approach. And I guess the other thing that we could briefly talk about is we talked about on-premises and the ability to connect through an on-premise data gateway if you were using Power Automate, and that becomes sort of a natural or like a path that's been taken before from a Power Platform perspective. But certainly when you have APIM in the mix too, you also can take advantage of VNet integration as well. So maybe you do have that Azure bot, you need to reach into local resources. APIM would also provide that gateway for you to connect in using that approach as well. So I think there's some options people have based upon sort of their needs, if it's low code all the way to pro code for on-premises data access as well.
Yeah, I think the benefit of this design is it does set you up for success for other projects, right? Other Power Platform projects. So you could have Power Apps. I mean, Power Apps automatically will connect into APIM and use that. But any kind of downstream UI that is part of your architecture can call into that, and you can reuse them. Yeah. So, quick summary of what we've talked about today. When using Power Virtual Agents, there's a number of approaches you can choose to build out that extensibility. Just make sure you understand the differences between them and the trade-offs with each one. But if in doubt, start with Power Automate, because it's going to be quicker and easier to test your solution. And then if you are looking to wider integration, look at the API gateway pattern as a really good way to connect in other assets to your infrastructure. Cool. So this was the fourth in our 6 sessions. So we'll be back for another 2 sessions. Or if you haven't seen the previous ones, please go and take a look. Please like and subscribe. I always forget to say that, but Kent's got me remembering to do it now. Or ask questions in the chat. That's all we had for today, I think. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
You bet. Thank you.